One, opposition's case is outcome dependent on the specific outcome that bailing out is actually able to achieve the benefits that they see on their end. E.g., that these corporations or these institutions are actually able to be revived somewhat in order to fulfill their critical roles within society, and to an extent that it is able to prevent the complete fallout that they describe, where people are going hungry on the streets or are no longer able to provide for themselves. The main push coming from proposition is very clear, that bailouts aren't actually able to save corporations to the full extent that opposition wants you to believe that they do. So I'll be folding in my responses to my points. But first, it's that corporations that are likely to actually be able to utilize bailouts to the extent that opposition says they are able to are probably healthy enough to survive through other alternative means, which Steph already mentioned to you. This looks like increased credit windows and leniency, or acquisitions like what would happen with Silicon Valley Bank. If the situation is salvageable enough that bailouts are actually likely to work, then alternatives are equally likely to work in order to ensure that A, fallout doesn't spread, as again what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, or B, that these corporations are actually able to restructure or be restructured by an external entity, and so in the way that is long-term or sustainable in the long term. So we tell you that this then leads into the second point, where critical sectors that have failed permanently, that can no longer be addressed by alternatives like increased credit windows, or are no longer willing to be acquired by other private corporations, have probably failed and are permanently gone, part of zombie sectors. What does this necessarily mean? We think opposition is right in pointing out that maybe it's not always stupid decisions that lead to corporations failing. Maybe it's the result of external factors. Like maybe if we're talking about the energy industry, it may be oil running out, or for tourism industries where people are just no longer willing to visit these countries anymore. And that says a lot, because if you're failing as a result of an external factor, it means no matter how much money you pour back into these industries, they're unlikely to be able to revive and to be able to restructure in the long term. Which means, at best, you're pouring in a ton of money for a corporation that isn't going to survive past a few months, a year, or 2 years, and the same people that you were supposed to help with the money that you spent in this corporation are going to be jobless again, and you've lost the amount of money that you could have spent preparing like welfare programs for them, or preparing to transition them to other industries that are more sustainable. And as a result, note that corporate or governments only have so much money to spend. And when we're talking about industries at the scale that they have to be bailed out because they're critical to the economy, billions of dollars of worth of money has to be invested. And that's a large chunk of the fiscal budget. That means that if you invest this money into bad liabilities, establishing and rebuilding in fact becomes more difficult. This directly flips opposition's point. Because you need that money to be able to invest in other industries to increase your capacity to be able to take in the stragglers or the employees of these corporations and rebuild other alternative, more resilient financial structures. The moment you invest all of your money into a sinking boat, you no longer have that money to restructure. But then thirdly, if you on the point of like foreign investment, if you only invest in a country because there are safety mechanisms, that is the tipping point for you deciding you want to invest in that country. What does that say about your confidence and own internal safety mechanisms? Because if the risk of failure is that high, then we'd rather not accept that form of investment in the first place. If you're only willing to invest in a country like the Philippines, for example, because if I fail, the government's going to bail me out, then it means that's probably a risky venture if that's the tipping point that makes you decide that, I'm not willing to invest in this country if they don't have bailouts. And actually, it is precisely for that reason, however, that large multinational corporations, the primary stakeholders that typically invest in internationally, don't need bailouts. They only invest if A, that they're sure they can advise, but B, they also have the liquidity to withstand complete failure. So probably bailouts are not a very large determining factor of whether or not multinational corporations invest in other like local or like foreign companies or countries, like the Philippines or other third world countries. So if anything, in fact, a rigorous economic environment where there is no room for failure, where generally corporations have to be structured to become resilient because they know that the government isn't going to be there to bail out their failures, means that there's a much stricter form or set of regulations that are likely to exist for the corporations that do exist within these states. So as a foreign investor, I'm attracted to these types of economies because it means that the economies or the companies that I'm likely to work with within these domestic industries or these domestic economies are likely to be incredibly resilient and well structured. But then fourth, I tell you that it's not necessarily better if the private sector is the one that bails out these corporations. But one, they don't really explain this at LO, and coming from DLO, it's probably going to be a tad bit too late. Plus, they'll have to rebuild or either rebuild or knife what the first speaker says. But then, second, opposition seems to come from the perspective of first world nations, which, by the way, still fails for the reasons I've mentioned above. And the fact that first world nations have enough large corporations to make acquisitions a reality means that there's necessarily not any harm in big corporations having to invest a lot of money. Because if their only rationale is that large governments have more money to spend, then large corporations in these first world nations probably also have an equally large amount of money to spend. But more importantly, the crux of this debate is conducted probably in third world countries where people are most vulnerable. And in these countries, states often actually have less money than large monopolies or conglomerates that dominate them, and simply don't have the money to spend or to waste on trying to revive these corporations that have structurally failed. But before I move on, I'll let opposition POI to try to save their case. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nothing, it seems they can't salvage your case. So not only have I proven thus far that alternatives are likely to work as long and the same conditions that opposition argues that their bailouts work. But I've also explained in the cases where bailouts are the only option, the situation is probably too hopeless due to the result of external factors making rebuilding completely impossible. But even if you say, oh, it's just a short-term mechanism to prevent people to ensure that these critical industries are still there, does the government or the state have enough money to pour into these companies in the first place that they're able to get it back up and running and functioning to serve the critical duties as a bank, for example? I think not, because in the 2008 financial crisis, all they were able to do was barely manage to scrape by and get and pay off foreign debt that these companies owed. But they weren't able to get them back to functioning in their critical roles as banks and actually doing important things. Precisely for that reason is why the depression after the 2008 financial crisis occurred in the first place. Because the bailouts were not able to fulfill the important functions that opposition says that they would be able to. And I think the proof is in the pudding there. Which is for the same reason, which is why the government declined to give Silicon Valley Bank a bailout, because they already knew what the outcome would be. It simply isn't able to fulfill their primary roles, nor is it able to save people. So we're telling you, invest your money wisely, save that money for restructuring, rebuilding, creating alternative industries, offering alternative solutions for corporations that actually have a chance, and making sure that that money is spent on people that are actually able to utilize it properly, and guiding them or transitioning them to alternative industries and making sure that they're all right and fine, rather than wasting it on zombie sectors that have no hope of surviving. I think as early as now, it's pretty clear that proposition has already won. Thank you.